Talking here with Jelmer Mommers, who's in Amsterdam, who's a journalist who's been doing some in-depth reporting on aspects of the climate problem, and has a remarkable piece up. There's a long version in Dutch, and
Yeah,
a shorter version, a little bit co-reported with Damien Carrington in the Guardian.
right.
It's kind of telling a story with fresh angle that as with the Exxon revelations the last couple of years, it's pretty clear that the big oil companies and certainly the coal companies too, but maybe they're more secretive, um, understood the basics of this of climate science for a long time. This particular tape, can you tell me like how did you find it? And it's remarkably well done. The science is
Yeah.
so spot on. So just tell us a little bit about how this unfolded.
Yeah, well, actually, it was a while ago that a source that I was in contact with said, I have something for you, I think you should see it. And he sent me a digital file, and it was a digitalized version of the film we just put out. Um, so I watched it. I was amazed because it's a 1991 Shell movie. It's from the Shell film unit, and it explains in great detail. The first 10 minutes of the film are basically the best climate explainer ever. It uses animations, which were, I think, pretty state of the art at that time, um, and it shows you exactly how the effect works, and then it really explains what sort of consequences we can expect. And like you said, the science was spot on. And so the rest of the film, the other 20 minutes of the short film, deal with the sort of solutions that one could apply. And so I started investigating, why would Shell make this movie? What was their purpose? Why did they do stuff like this? So I investigated the Shell film unit and things like that. And then, of course, I wasn't completely satisfied with just the digital file, because I thought I wasn't even 100% sure that it was actually Shell's. Maybe somebody would have photoshopped it. So I went back to the source. I said, I need your source. I need to know where it actually came from. And so he put me in contact with somebody else. And finally, I got the videotape. And I actually have the VHS videotape right here, right now. And we photographed it. It's in the piece, and it's just the object is wonderful. It's shocking because on the cover of it, you see starving people who are migrating, supposedly because they ran out of food because of the effects of climate change. So it's really, yeah, it really got me. And then I've been investigating Shell for longer, and somebody else, some other source, also gave me documents, internal documents, confidential internal documents from the 80s and the 90s, which spoke about what Shell knew about climate change. So I combined these two. So today we revealed the film, and I wrote a very, very in-depth piece based on these publications, on these reports, in which they explain exactly what they knew. For instance, the most interesting report is from 1986 already, and it's called The Greenhouse Effect. Um, so
Yeah.
that's the material.
And I guess Shell is interesting. They're kind of unusual. BP as well. They both have these public. They do these long-term forecasts of energy
Mhm.
use and stuff. They run scenarios. That's been there in the background as well. And what seems to be distinct from the sort of the Exxon model was that these were materials that were expressly for public consumption. You know, can you tell me, tell us a little bit about where they were intended to be shown?
The film, you
Yeah, yeah,
mean?
yeah. The film.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the film was made. Shell actually began doing this in the 1920s. When they were in the Dutch East Indies, they were doing oil projects, and they wanted to show the people back home how positive their influences
Yeah.
was. So they made films. They had good directors from the Dutch movie scene fly there, make films, and show them to all the noblesse, or how do you say, like the elites back home. So the politicians, the journalists, and
Yeah.
everyone would see that Shell was superior, bringing wealth to the world. And they kept on doing this. So they made, for instance, one very famous film they made is called The Underwater Search from 1965. That's actually online already. And it shows you how magnificent Shell is at drilling for oil beneath the seabed. So things like that are ways of Shell's attempts to influence the public debate in Shell's favor, and they were meant also to create goodwill, to show them that if any company would be the one to do all the oil and gas, it should be Shell.
Yeah.
And the climate of concern is in the same tradition. It just shows to society that Shell is taking these issues very seriously.
Yeah, the timing is interesting too. That 1991 date is just ahead of the Earth Summit in Rio, the first climate treaty. So climate
Right.
change, from 1988 onward, it had become a very public issue, and maybe this represents what you're talking about, them trying to get out ahead of it in some way or other. Um,
Yeah.
but then you do the reporting you do on their policies and stuff does demonstrate this disconnect, or at least a different interpretation of what to do about this body of science than the world, for the most part, through the treaty and other steps has decided is best.
Yeah.
And you got some input from Shell on this. Can you sort of summarize that for folks?
What you mean, Shell's response?
Yeah, their response or their sense of why this isn't illogical or unethical.
Yeah, well, they just say, basically, they always say that their company is doing two things for the world, which are very important. They're delivering energy for growing energy demand, and they're delivering lower carbon energy. So they tell us, because they're doing natural gas, they're a superior oil company, because they invest more in natural gas than oil, which is all fine and good. Of course, we all know that there's big issues with things like methane leakages in the natural gas system. So actually, natural gas is not the best thing ever, for one. So I don't find that very convincing. But it's pretty obvious that Shell is still telling this story, and it has done so for 30 years, because, frankly, they can't figure out a way, I think, to solve the dilemma. They're sort of stuck between the idea of wanting to be a force of good in the world in ways in terms of being sustainable, but they also want to provide, oil and gas for economic growth. And growth back then and even now is often fossil fuel growth. So that's their dilemma, and they've shown from the beginning that they are not able to solve the dilemma themselves. And so what I would conclude is that governments need to solve the dilemma. And actually, that's what they say in the 1991 film. There's an explicit quote in there that says, governments are having to consider their actions. But then, that's where it starts to get weird, because then you would say, okay, so Shell is basically saying, governments, please solve this for us. But in fact, then, when the governments try to come up with things, Shell wants to be at those discussions, and it wants to discuss what kind of policies would be economically viable and what sort of policies wouldn't be. So, and that's where I think, because I think Shell is not, I don't believe in the image of Shell being evil or people working there having bad intentions, but I do think that this particular thing is sort of hypocritical. Because if you say let governments fix it, then please let them do it and don't meddle. Don't tell them what to do, because that's what Shell did in the movie and in the documents as well. They try to control the terms of debate so that they can control what sort of policies will be applied. And of course, that's always a policy that won't hurt Shell's business.
Right. And you point out in the reporting that they remain members of, well, things like the American Petroleum Institute or other trade organizations that have been lobbying pretty hard, and with a lot of influence, especially in a place like the United States, against to slow that whatever policy change comes, to make it slow and to make sure they're not unfairly singled out, that kind of thing. So
that's especially strong in America, actually. I think more so than here. Yeah. You see that Shell left the American Legislative Executive. Sorry, I forgot the name. ALEC. Yeah. They left those behind in August 2015, I think. But and you can say, well done, but it's quite late. They were there all the time. And so here in Europe, they are members of chemistry industry groups, for instance. who lobby against the EU ETS, the emissions trading scheme we have here, to
Yeah.
put a price on carbon. So you see that they on the one hand they say we want a price on carbon. On the other hand, they're a member of lobby groups who try to do everything possible to keep there for being a good price on carbon. So there's a sort of slight schizophrenia there.
Yeah, it seems to be the case, and of course, the influence of the big energy companies in places like Washington and elsewhere, and even in the treaty process over the years, is big. You know, it's considering that there's other sectors that might not be adequately represented in those
Yeah,
decisions, whether it's
yeah,
poor people in sub-Saharan Africa or where.
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you do your reporting and about the Correspondent, the publication that you work for?
Yeah, we're an ad-free member-funded organization. We launched in 2013, um, and we have. Oh shit! I should know this. Well, I think we have over 30,000 members at least. I should look up the number, but anyway, so those people make sure that we can do the work we do. That puts us completely free from advertisers, and it puts journalists like me in a position where we can say, this will be our topic for the next 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years. So mine is climate and energy. And basically I will start a conversation with my readers and we'll say, guys, I think this is an important topic. What do you think? And we'll start from there, and we'll together with readers we try to find out what kinds of subjects should be covered. Of course, I have my own ideas about that. And then we start series. So for instance, the Shell piece I'm publishing today are a result of a call I did over a year ago on the Correspondent to Shell employees. Actually, I told Shell, I made a letter to Shell employees and I said, please, can we talk? Because people are always talking about you, but they're never talking with you. And I'm so curious what you think about climate, and I think what you think about people who speak badly of your company. And so I published interviews with Shell employees, and that sort of got me in the company better, so I know better what's going on. And that led to people sharing documents with me. It led me to write analyses about what they do and what they don't do, and stuff like that. So it's really we start from scratch and we build it from there. And it takes a lot of stamina, but it really does deliver, because readers will be able to see every week or every other day when I publish something, he's still doing it. Okay, let me check what he's doing now. Let me give him feedback. And so there's an interesting relation of trust being established, I think, which a lot of other media don't have anymore.
It's interesting. Yeah, and this kind of open source approach to investigative journalism, I think, has borne fruit here too. David Fahrenthold, a reporter for the Washington Post, when he was writing about Trump's charities,
Yeah,
he recently spoke to us here at ProPublica about
yeah,
the process, and it was very much an open process. Do you think of
yeah,
the old model of investigative journalism was very different? Everyone hides away and
yeah.
springs the findings, but you see this evidence that it's working for you.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting example too. But the thing is, I mean, some things you will have to keep secret. So, for instance, I couldn't, if I would have said, "Hey, people, I found this film half a year ago," then obviously Shell would have tried to. I mean, I assume they would have tried to block me from doing anything with it. So there are issues there. So you can't
Yeah.
obviously you can't put everything online, but for a lot of things, this does work, I think. Yeah,
Um, this issue of these hypocrisy, uh, these examples of hypocrisy pop up over and over again. You had in the article that's in the Guardian. There's this um, section that is sort of broadens out and says, you know, there's a role for government. There are others. These issues are not just within a company. And it reminded me a little bit about, I think I mentioned in an email to you, Norway is a classic example of a place that's gotten a lot of green credit for its domestic clean electricity push, including EVs, cars. I was over there a year ago, and Elon Musk gave a talk, and it was all yay, yay, yay. And a woman in the audience though said, "Yeah, but Mr. Musk, what do you feel about the fact that Norway runs most of its social programs on oil and gas revenue, and they're drilling
Yeah.
more. He and Musk had he said, well, we're going to need oil for a long time to come, even while I turn out my revolutionary cars. And so those realities are in there, embedded in many parts of the
Yeah.
conversation, and in ways that
Yeah.
aren't obvious always.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think it's the same goes for Holland actually,
Hmm.
because we, like Norway, we got rich of natural gas. We have this huge reserve in the north of our country, and we used that to gain this extreme wealth. But now, when we need to make a true transformation to get to a climate neutral energy system, there's a lot less enthusiasm. There's a lot of green talk, but there's very little action. Actually, our state was sued um, by a climate action group on behalf of citizens for doing too little to get down the greenhouse gas emissions. And the citizens won. It was the climate case. It was quite famous a few years ago, I think, 1 year ago.
Well,
So, yeah, yeah,
well, we'll have to stay in touch because I feel we're on parallel journeys here. And
yeah,
the good news about the climate problem is it's so uh, prismatic, it's so complicated and large that everyone has a role to play in addressing it in some way. And there's aspects of the journalism that can only really emerge effectively if they're sort of a community enterprise. Because the story has so many angles and facets. So
yeah,
there may be ways
I agree.
to partner going forward. We'll talk about that.